around 1200 BC. The world was more connected than it had any right to be. Egypt was trading grain with Cyprus. Cyprus was sending copper to the Hittites. The Hittites were exchanging goods with the Mycenaean Greeks. The Mycenaeans were importing tin from as far away as Afghanistan. Merchant ships moved through the Mediterranean loaded with ivory, gold, wine, textiles, and obsidian. For 500 years, this network had held. Empires rose and expanded, and sometimes fought each other, and sometimes didn't. But the trade kept moving. The cities kept growing. The scribes kept writing. The palaces kept storing grain and redistributing it across the countryside. A complex, layered, interdependent Bronze Age civilization stretched from Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia. And then, within the space of approximately 50 years, almost all of it was gone, not conquered by a single empire, not absorbed into something larger. Gone. The palaces burned. The trade routes went silent. The writing systems disappeared. In some regions, the population dropped by 90%. Cities that had existed for centuries were abandoned and never rebuilt. And for 300 to 400 years afterward, the people living in the ruins of the civilization had no writing, no long-distance trade, no monumental architecture, and apparently very little memory of what had come before. It is the single most catastrophic civilizational collapse in recorded history, and nobody knows with certainty why it happened. The Hittite Empire at its peak controlled most of what is now Turkey, parts of Syria, and had fought Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot battles ever recorded. They had iron. They had a sophisticated legal code. They had diplomatic correspondence with every major power of the age. Their capital, Hattusa, was a massive fortified city of tens of thousands of people. Around 1180 BCE, Hattusa was burned, not abandoned slowly, not besieged for years, burned. The population was gone. The city was never rebuilt. Within a generation, the Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful states the ancient world had yet produced, ceased to exist entirely. In the same decades, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece burned one after another. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos. The palace at Pylos apparently had some warning. Archaeologists found evidence that Linear B tablets were being written at a frantic pace in the final hours, recording the emergency deployment of rowers and soldiers to defend the coastline. It didn't help. Pylos burned and was never reoccupied. Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared with the palaces. The Greeks would spend the next 400 years without any writing at all. In the city of Ugarit on the coast of what is now Syria, archaeologists found something that still stands as one of the most haunting artifacts of the ancient world. A clay tablet, a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, written in the final days before the city's destruction. It had never been sent. The letter described ships sighted at sea, an attack imminent. The king of Ugarit had already sent his own military forces elsewhere. He had nothing left to defend the city. He was asking Cyprus for ships and soldiers. The tablet was still in the kiln when Ugarit fell. The city was destroyed. The fires were hot enough to accidentally fire the clay tablets that had been left in storage, preserving them permanently, including the letter that never arrived, including the reply that never came. Ugarit was never rebuilt. So who did this? Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III describe a series of invasions by groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. The texts are vivid. Foreigners from the islands, Ramesses wrote, were making a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed. No land could stand before their arms. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian carvings, warriors in distinctive feathered headdresses, fighting from ships and from ox carts carrying their families. They destroyed the Hittites, Egypt's records claim. They destroyed Ugarit. They moved through the Mediterranean, leaving nothing standing behind them. Ramesses III claims to have defeated them at the Battle of the Delta around 1175 BCE. Egypt survived, though weakened. Almost everything to the north and east did not. For a century, the Sea Peoples were the answer historians reached for, a massive migration of displaced peoples, possibly from the Aegean or Anatolia, sweeping through the Mediterranean and destroying everything they touched. Simple, dramatic, a single cause for a single catastrophe. But the more archaeologists looked, the less the story held together. because the destruction at different sites doesn't match a single invading force moving in one direction. Some cities were burned. Some were abandoned peacefully. Some show evidence of internal revolt. Warehouses looted from the inside. Some simply stopped receiving trade goods and slowly emptied out over decades. The pattern is not an invasion. The pattern is a system coming apart. In 2014, a climate scientist named Brandon Drake published a paper analyzing ancient pollen records and sediment cores from across the eastern Mediterranean. He found something that the historical record had not been able to show. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged drought, not a single bad year. A multi-decade reduction in rainfall that would have devastated grain production across Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant simultaneously. The Bronze Age economies were built on grain surpluses managed and redistributed by palace bureaucracies. The palaces stored grain in good years and distributed it in bad years. That was their function. That was the reason they existed. A multi-decade drought doesn't produce a bad year. It drains the surplus. Then it drains the reserves. Then it produces famine. Then famine produces internal instability. Then internal instability produces a collapse of the palace system that was the only thing holding the distribution network together. And then people move. And moving people look like an invasion to the people they encounter. The Sea Peoples may not have been a single unified force of conquerors. They may have been the refugees. Eric Klein, a historian at George Washington University, has spent much of his career studying the Bronze Age collapse. His book on the subject, published in 2014, makes an argument that has become the leading framework for understanding what happened. He calls the system's collapse. The late Bronze Age Mediterranean wasn't just wealthy, it was deeply interconnected. The copper for bronze came primarily from Cyprus. The tin came from Afghanistan or Britain. Neither was available close to where bronze was actually used. If the supply chain for either metal broke down, bronze production stopped. And without bronze, the military and agricultural systems that depended on bronze tools and weapons began to fail. The palace redistribution system required surplus grain. Surplus grain required normal rainfall. Normal rainfall disappeared. The trade networks required stable politics in every node. The politics stopped being stable when the grain ran out. And once one node failed, the interconnection that had made the system so powerful became the mechanism of its destruction. A disruption in Cyprus affected the Hittites. A disruption in the Hittites affected Ugarit. A disruption in Ugarit affected Egypt. Each failure accelerated the next. It wasn't one cause. It was every cause at once. The drought weakened the grain supply. The grain shortage destabilized the palaces. The destabilized palaces stopped redistributing resources. The people who depended on redistribution began to move. The movement disrupted the trade routes. The disrupted trade routes stopped the flow of copper and tin. The shortage of bronze weakened the militaries. The weakened militaries couldn't stop the people who were moving. And the people who were moving were hungry and desperate and had nowhere to go back to. In the ruins of Megiddo in what is now Israel, archaeologists found the remains of a merchant's house from around 1200 BCE. Inside, they found an ivory cosmetic box, a collection of card plaques, gold jewelry, the goods of a prosperous family at the center of a thriving trade network. The house had been abandoned in a hurry. The goods were left behind. Nobody came back for them. The family that left the house vanished into the same darkness that swallowed the Hittite scribes, the Ugarit merchants, the Mycenaean rowers who were deployed in the final hours to defend Pylos. They left no account of what happened. They left no explanation. They left a cosmetic box and a set of carved ivory plaques in an abandoned house in a city that would not recover for 400 years. Here is what the science and the archaeology tell us now. The Bronze Age collapse was not one event. It was a cascade, a drought that lasted decades, a famine that emptied the grain stores, a breakdown in the trade networks that had kept the entire system supplied, a movement of people so large that the civilizations they passed through recorded it as an invasion, internal revolts in palaces that could no longer provide what they had promised, earthquakes that damaged cities already weakened by everything else. A disease that spread through populations that were already hungry and already moving. No single one of these was enough. All of them together, happening simultaneously to a system that had no redundancy and no way to fail safely, was the most advanced civilization the ancient world had yet produced was brought down not by a conqueror, not by a single catastrophe, but by the accumulated weight of a system that had grown too complex and too interdependent to survive when several of its foundations failed at once. And here's the part that the historians writing about 1200 BC always mention carefully, and always slightly reluctantly. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was not uniquely fragile. Every complex interconnected system is vulnerable to cascade failure. Every system that depends on multiple supply chains, stable climate, and distributed political cooperation carries this risk. The more interconnected and efficient a system becomes, the less able it is to absorb a simultaneous failure in multiple areas. The Bronze Age didn't collapse because it was primitive. It collapsed because it was sophisticated. And the researchers who study it most carefully have noted, without quite saying it directly, that the features that made it vulnerable to collapse in 1200 BC are not features unique to the Bronze Age. They are features of any system complex enough to work at all.